Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP stream. Give one moment. Yeah, so yesterday I posted a video about the judiciary, about the Supreme Court, SCOTUS, our precious SCOTUS. And let's just go through some evidence here. Let's start by going through some evidence. Sonia Sotomayor, Supreme Court Justice, her party is the Democratic Party. And she was appointed by Barack Obama, also a Democrat. Okay. Brett Kavanaugh, another Supreme Court Justice. His party what's his party? Let's see here. Okay, he's a Republican, and he was appointed by Trump, also a Republican. Stephen Breyer, another Supreme Court Justice. His political party is the Democratic Party, and he was appointed by Bill Clinton, also a Democrat. All right. Let's see here. Tim Gorsuch, another Supreme Court Justice. Gorsuch. His political party Tim Gorsuch's political party, well, it's safe to say he's a Republican. I mean, he votes, doesn't he? As a United States citizen. It's his political party. Going through credible sources here. Nothing. All right. You just ask the question a bit more succinctly. Is Tim Gorsuch a Republican? Okay. Is Tim Gorsuch a Republican? Let's try to find a good source on this. Oh my gosh. How is this unobtainable, virtually unobtainable data? Okay, whatever. Whatever. Tim Gorsuch, probably a Republican, because he was appointed by a Republican. All right. Who else is on the Supreme Court right now? The Chief Justice, John Roberts. John Roberts is a Republican, and he was appointed by George W. Bush, also a Republican. Okay. What are the other justices? Mr. Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas again, this is not, it's based on just a few brief searches. It seems somewhat ambiguous. Elena Kagan. Well, she worked in the government, right? Before she was a Supreme Court justice, she was in some sort of advisory capacity. Elena Kagan. Seems she's also a Democrat. I think that she worked for a Democratic administration. Probably safe to assume that she does vote Democrat if she worked for the Democrats. Other justices, whatever her name is, newest. That's what's her name is Amy Coney Barrett or Barret, whatever her name is. If she's French, if she's German, whatever, Barrett, or English, Barrett. She's French ancestry. Barret. Amy. She apparently there's good evidence that she votes Republican, and she was appointed by Donald Trump, who's also a Republican. I think I've gone through all the primary justices, probably all of them. I think that feels like all of them. I didn't count. Okay, so I'm detecting that there's some alignment here where, Democrat presidents nominate, Democrat Supreme Court justices, and, through compromises on the Judiciary Committee, install Democrats in the Supreme Court. Republicans typically seems to nominate people that vote Republican, and if things win, if they don't bork it, then, as they say, then they're going to install people that vote Republican, right, or Democrat, whichever point I was on. Okay, so there's this alignment between. There's a sympathy, right? Presidents who are in charge of nominating new Supreme Court justices, as approved by the Senate Judiciary Committee, and approved by the Senate, not just the Judiciary Committee, vetted by the Judiciary Committee, publicly and through the media, and then passed on to vote in the whole Senate, right? So first, these justices pass through committee investigations, and then they're submitted to the Senate for a vote, for approval, right? Even when, right, there's some deference to the president in his ability to nominate, but also his ability to nominate in a discriminating fashion a new Supreme Court justice. And so generally they are approved. The Senate there's a point of deference between the executive and the legislative, or the Senate and the president, with regard to who becomes the next Supreme Court justice, even if it is the Republican Party controlling the Senate. Got a Democrat in the White House and Republicans in the Senate. Regardless, the president's nominees seem to pass through, unless of course he borks it, as they say. Okay, fine. What's the problem, though? I mean, is there a problem here? I think so. I think that I've heard the quote, judges are politicians in robes. And I talked in the previous video about how it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not like Republicans are installing Republican judges and Democrats are installing Democratic judges, right? There are no such things as a Republican or a Democratic judge, as you'll learn in law school. Or if you go into more sophisticated analysis of jurisprudence and the relationship between a judge's political identity and his own jurisprudence, his or her own jurisprudence. So it's a bit more complicated than that. It's not as if Republicans are installing Republicans, and it's not. The court is seen to be beyond parties and beyond politics, and that's sort of an ideal that we have about the court, to ensure that they're qualified to render interpretations about what the law means, how pieces of legislation, executive orders comport with legal principles, and whether those things are legally valid, right? So it's a bit more complicated. I mean, you're not just going to, you don't really have Republican and Democratic judges. They don't really split that way. If that were the case, the court would divide far more often than it does. Even Democratic and Republican citizens acting as judges can come together on what the law means, what it was intended to achieve, how it comports with previously existing textually derived legal principles, and how all of that works. and all that's fair to me. And I think everyone recognizes that, the whole point of a judge is that he's unbiased. He's not affected by his party bias, right? But it all depends on how objective you think humans can be and how much they can separate between their party affiliation, their political ethical principles, and their thinking on jurisprudence and what happens to be legally valid, right? If you think a person, I think that people can do that. I think people can effectively compartmentalize. I don't necessarily, I'm not exaggerating the situation in the sense that, no, I don't think, I think the fact that the court does not divide in a politically motivated way indicates that it's a bit more complicated than there being Republican or Democratic judges. However, Republicans tend to prefer a certain judicial philosophy and Democrats prefer another. And the way that judges think about certain things can align very closely with their conservative or liberal temperament. Conservative justices, so-called conservative justices, originalists, and textualists, they think that they can know what the intent was behind a principle or an edict or a constitutional amendment or a constitutional precept. And they believe that they assume that they can, through various means, various forms of evidence, derive the intent of the law, and they enforce that original intent as democratically elected representatives conceived and derived and enforced them. That's the assumption that those judges depend on. Right? Liberal justices find it a bit more ambiguous, as they don't simply rely upon intent. They think that intent is at times unknowable, and thus they're less constrained. Conservative judges like to think that they're constrained by original intent, and probably are to some extent. And liberal judges aren't really sure what the intent really was, or so that they just have different analytical methodologies, one relying primarily on history and the other relying upon some more nebulous concept of what the law, of how we can know what the law means. And and I won't render a judgment as to what is a superior judicial methodology. I won't do that because I'm not so sure I've made a decision on that yet. However, but you'll find in various rulings when the court does divide that the judgments of these liberal and conservative judges closely align with the policy preferences of the parties that nominated and accepted and approved them. I think that when the court does divide, it can sometimes even do so on ideological or party lines and can render judicial judgments and interpretive judgments that do in some way align with the policy preferences of the party that nominated and approved them. And so, but why is this a problem? Why is it a problem that, are judges politicians in robes? I don't think so. I don't think they're politicians in robes. I think that they're judges in robes. And I think that I don't question their sense of their own objectivity, although they themselves should question that to remain objective. But I don't think it's as simple as there being politicians in robes, and I won't subscribe to that popular expression. However, the court has a very unique role, and there's a very unique power that the court has. In many ways, it's not the final arbiter. It can be checked in various ways. But as to the legitimacy of law, as enacted by Congress and approved by the executive, it is an arbiter. I won't say that it's the final arbiter. I'll say that it's an important arbiter. And that really is inarguable, right? It has a very unique role. These persons installed upon the court have life tenure, right? So they're there for a very long time. And so whenever a party gets an opportunity, to nominate, and remember, the government is controlled, all of our democracy, our republic, our government, and any political discretionary matter is controlled by these parties. And so for the most part, maybe for all the part, right? Maybe for all parts, right? It's certainly more than some. I'd say in most cases, yeah, it's just totally controlled by these parties that we have, this binary party system. So when a party, parties have their policy preferences. They represent different classes of people, and they have, they have entirely different philosophical, ethical, and policy approaches to things. And when they sniff up an opportunity, right, to enhance the power, to put power behind their policy preferences, right, and if they can see the court as a way of doing that, well, then they're going to take that opportunity, right? There's no question that they're going to take that opportunity. These parties are biased, right? I mean, these aren't wise, objective statesmen. These are, as the founders wanted our leaders and representatives to be, they're angling for a particular ideology, right? They're not so much, they're not objective, right? They're ideological. And the court is not to be ideological. It's to be objective. So if I'm equating parties with ideology, then parties and the Supreme Court cannot be ideological, right? It needs to be beyond ideology. Then so the court needs to be beyond parties. And I think that's just a generally important thing. But with the current system that we have, with the decision on who becomes a Supreme Court justice being a political matter, when it's a political matter in this country, it's controlled by these parties, right? Thus, Republicans will install judges sympathetic to their policy preferences and their general temperament and ideology and philosophy. And liberals will install judges. It's on both sides, not just conservatives. Liberals do the same thing. We'll find people that are, well, I mean, look objective and compartmentalizing and discriminating and smart enough, but ultimately align with them on their basic temperament, their basic approach toward the world and life and toward people. And so these parties simply can't be trusted to, I mean, the court is, they're too ideological. And the court is beyond ideology, therefore it has to be beyond the parties. Therefore, it should not be a matter of party decision who becomes the next Supreme Court justice, right? I mean, parties should not be involved in this process. I don't even necessarily think they should be involved at all in government. I don't think that they're a good thing. I think a binary party system is even worse. I think what it inevitably leads to with the system we have is that when Democrats win, Republicans aren't represented. And when Republicans win, Democrats aren't represented. That's not democratic. That's the tyranny of the majority problem. And parties are a direct manifestation of that in the way that our system is currently set up, right? I'm not saying that democracy is some ideal, something to be preserved, that the founders were right on everything. They certainly weren't. The whole original Constitution was a political creation, derived and enforced and motivated by political motives. There was no better. I mean, we look at the politicians we have now. Oh, we wouldn't trust them. They're politicians. Well, but we would trust the founders. Right? No, the founders were politicians too. I mean, we really have to question the whole system. There's nothing sacred about it. And the moment that we assume that it's worth preserving because it's some kind of sacred thing is the moment that we just allow it to devolve into inefficiency, undemocratic tendencies, and at worst, a kind of tyranny, which we'd want to avoid. Because we regard, in any case, I don't want to get too philosophical, but what is an alternative, right? I mean, we have to ensure that these justices are not ideological, like the parties are, right? We have to ensure that they're beyond these parties. We have to ensure that they're objective, meaning beyond ideology. How do we do that? It's hard, right? Because how do we decide? If it can't be a political, we have to concede that parties exist. So if it's a political discretionary matter, politics decide, then parties decide, right? If we allow politics to decide, parties decide. That's a bad thing. So how do we do it, right? What's the alternative to a system of judicial appointment, of Supreme Court appointment, right, where we just don't have the parties involved? Well, because the parties are so powerful in this country, anything that we leave to politicians is going to be dictated by the parties, right? And we can't really avoid that because we have to concede the parties will continue to exist and they'll continue to remain in power, okay? I mean, this is not I'm not imagining some kind of utopia. There are certain facts and realities we have to concede. I proceed about political science, even though economics is called the dismal science. I would regard political science should also be a dismal science, and that there are just realities we have to concede to and work around them. That was the whole point of the design of the government, that power checks power. Okay, so what's the alternative? I mean, if a Supreme Court justice expires, how do we decide who fills that seat? I don't think the party should decide. I think that we should block parties from that process. The problem is we can't leave it to the people because then the parties are involved. Again, any political thing involves the parties. What's the alternative then? How the hell do we decide? I would suggest there is a very clear alternative to the system of party dictated control over who becomes the next Supreme Court justice, right? I would say that when a justice expires, we should move toward a system of what I call automatic appellate promotion, right? Because these are appellate courts. We can't get politics and parties totally out of the process of deciding who controls and who thinks, or who controls the judiciary, right? What kind of thinking dominates the judiciary? We can't totally remove them from that process. We just don't want a party to be able to install their own stooges on the Supreme Court, which only allows their policy preferences to become a kind of tyranny of the majority, right? But then with life tenure, right? So they're just installing those sympathetic to their policy preferences in one part of government, right? So they're basically Republicans and Democrats with life tenure. That's horrible. That's a threat to democracy. That's a threat to a balanced approach to policy that is non-ideological, more evidence concerned, and more objective, right? Tribalism and ideology should not dictate the form of policy. It should be based on evidence, logic, proper argumentation, and all of those things, right? I know that that's not idealistic. That's necessary. Whether or not I would regard as a necessary good, right? Whereas now the whole system is built upon necessary evils. Whereas I think it's not too idealistic to think that it can be built upon necessary goods. Okay, so what's the alternative? I call it automatic appellate promotion. When a Supreme Court justice dies, the next Supreme Court justice the next Supreme Court justice will be an automatically promoted member of one of the federal appeals courts, right? Who is the longest serving member of that court. So instead of it being a political process, it would be a randomized process by which politicians can still control who goes onto the district courts. They can nominate them and approve them. That's fine. I think politics at that level is unavoidable. But at the level of the Supreme Court, let's rely on randomization, right? Let's move toward a system away from political appointments to the Supreme Court toward a system of randomized automatic appellate promotion, where the next Supreme Court justice after one expires is simply the longest serving member on one of the federal district courts, right? Federal district or federal appeals courts. And I think by doing that, the parties no longer get to guarantee who gets onto the court, what policy preference will reign. They don't get to decide that, right? A process of randomization and automatic promotion does. And is this not a good thing? Is this not better? You remove the ideology of parties from the process, which we would regard as an inherently bad thing in any part of the government. We just have to concede now that it's a necessary evil. But also, you remove parties from that process entirely, and you also ensure that it's certainly possible that if it's the longest serving member, it's a pretty old guy or an old woman, and they're not going to be on the court for very long. So what? I don't necessarily think people should be on the court for that long anyway. I don't think that's a good thing. I think they become insulated. I think they become detached. I think they become too steeped in their own methodologies. I think it's probably a good thing that it's a person with, if it's the longest serving member of one of the federal appeals courts, right? It's going to be a highly experienced person, right? They're going to probably be pretty old, but not necessarily, right? Logically, they'd probably be somewhat older than what a politician would choose, what a party politician, and I'll be specific with that, a party politician, right? Rather than a statesman will choose. Yeah, who cares? So what? They're only on the court for a couple of years. Why do we want them on the court for more years? They already have a ton of experience from the appeals courts. If your argument that life tenure promotes experience among the justices, you still achieve that with this system because it's the longest serving member, an automatic promotion of the longest serving member of one of the federal appeals courts. Obviously, if they're the longest serving, they've got a ton of experience, right? Which is a probably good enough assumption. and they've got a lot of experience, and we don't get to dictate. The parties no longer, if it's randomized, the parties no longer get to dictate what particular ideology and ideologically motivated policy preference they're going to have reign on the court for the rest of their life, right? No, no, just randomize it. Automatic appellate promotion. Whoever the longest serving member is of one of the federal appeals courts, automatically promoted to the Supreme Court when one of them dies. Done. Problem solved. I don't see why this isn't looked to as a superior method. I think it's because the founders wanted democracy to be involved in this process of choosing the next Supreme Court justice, and that's fair. But our democracy has been bastardized by parties, so it's their whole purpose in having that system work and checking the court in that way. We still check the court. The other branches still check the judiciary because they still get to determine who's on the federal appeals courts. That's fine. I think politics at that level is unavoidable, but at the level of the Supreme Court, no, randomize it. I think that just ensures that and it's true. Yeah. Even at the level of the appeals courts, if the parties are still deciding who goes onto the appeals courts, well, then every judge is going to be biased in some way by some sort of policy preference ideology related to the party that nominated and approved them. That's true. You'll still have the same ideologies, but and party, the courts are naturally, if we decide who the next judges become, are naturally going to be affected by this party ideology problem. But okay, that's fine. But at the level of the Supreme Court, one of them dies at random, and then the next Supreme Court justice is just going to be the longest serving member of one of the federal appeals courts. And what ideology goes into that seat, right? If we assume that judges even are motivated ideologically, which I think is probably true. It's sad, but it's probably true. Humans can compartmentalize and be objective, but not perfectly. And when it comes to an area of ambiguity, I think you might push for a particular ideologically motivated, ethical or legal principle that you think is right. Really, it's just your ideology coloring your perception. So and then through that process of automatic appellate promotion of the longest serving member of one of the federal appeals courts, it's totally randomized what ideology gets into that seat, what kind of philosophy gets into that seat. Parties no longer get to control it. And I think the balance between those two philosophies that this would generate would ultimately produce a system with less tyranny of the majority, less party tyranny, or less ideological tyranny, less tribalism. The court we wouldn't have to go through this mess of politicization that we currently have with nominating Supreme Court justices, of sex scandals, and we bypass all of the crap and the inefficiency and the insult of that, which makes us an embarrassment to the rest of the world. And we simply just engage in a process of automatic appellate promotion. Longest serving member of one of the federal appeals courts at whatever time it is that one of the Supreme Court justices expires, install that guy or that woman, right? Or that girl. And yeah, I think that's good enough. I can't really foresee or conceive of another possibility of an alternative system. I don't think randomization is necessary. It's not totally random, first of all, because these judges were appointed at the lower level anyway. But at the highest level, no, I don't think that we should rely upon the parties to decide who gets to judge at the highest level. I think randomization is most certain, constrained randomization is preferred to party squabbling, and which is an insult to the rest of the world. So I think these highly politicized, media scrutinized Supreme Court hearings and Supreme Court nomination processes is just a big reality TV show that is totally unnecessary, comes with immense costs certain justices their entire careers, insults both the court, because then everyone thinks it's simply a political matter, right? I mean, and you can't avoid that perception. If these parties are deciding who goes onto the court, well, they're going to. I've already talked about this. I mean, there's this overlap between who nominates you to the Supreme Court and the party of that person and what your party is. I mean, I don't think that that's any kind of smoking gun evidence, but it's a fact, and that fact has consequences, whether we want to face them or not. So remove all of that. And I just think this is a much smarter system. It's not totally randomized. I mean, it's constrained randomization in the sense that we still appoint the appellate judges. It's just parties get to appoint the appellate judges, fine. Someone's got to do it. We have to concede that parties exist. It is a political matter. Democracy has to constrain the courts on some level. But at the level of the Supreme Court, no. I think it should just be a process of randomization. I think that's probably good enough. And it's not totally random anyway. It's constrained randomization. Longest serving member of one of the federal, whatever, of all of uh, of, whoever that is on one of the federal appeals courts becomes the next Supreme Court justice. Parties don't get to decide what philosophy gets into that seat and gets onto that bench, which I think is the problem. It's just maybe randomization promotes more objectivity in that way. Yeah, you're still going to get one of the two, right? We've got these two ruling judicial philosophies. When the courts divide, we've got these two judicial philosophies methodologically dissimilar. Yeah, so you're still going to get one of those two flavors of judicial methodology, but it's random which one. Parties don't get to decide. So anyway, what I'm suggesting here is that for this deciding who becomes the next Supreme Court justice, we move away from a system of political nomination toward a system of automatic appellate promotion. A system more randomized and probably more objective than the scandalous political nomination process we currently have. Thanks for watching.